Hi and welcome back to the Civil News. I am Shariff. Today we brought up to you the case of Lim Kim Hwa and Ho Chu Lan's and another live from the High Court of Cebu involving a transfer of a property. So in this case, the judge had ruled two elements as claimed by the plaintiff, which are undue influence and fraud under Contracts Act 1950. Under Section 16, subsection 1 of the Contracts Act 1950, it highlights the condition of a contract that is stated to be an undue influence. It is stated that when a person uses his position to benefit himself by dominating others, he is said to induce an undue influence to the other party to enter into a contract. Meanwhile, under Section 16, subsection 2 of the Contracts Act 1950, there is said an existence of an undue influence. The party must be in a position of dominating others. The next section discussed according to this case is Section 17 of the Contracts Act 1950 that governs the elements of fraud. While according to this section, there are 5 deceiving acts done with the intention by the party, or his connivance or by his agent, which induce the other party to a contract that is regarded as fraud. So there are the suggestion, which is in fact not true by anyone who does not believe it, the active concealment of proof by the person who knows or believes it, the person who makes the promise without any intention to honor it, and any act that is deemed to be fraud or anything that is fraudulent according to law.
So, what is facts? Facts are a statement of what happened which gave rise to legal issue and it is presented before the court. Assalamualaikum and good evening. My name is Alia and today I will share on facts contained in the case of Lim Kim Hwa and Ho Chu Lan and another. To begin with, the plaintiff Lim Kim Hwa was an old woman who was believed to have a poor memory and suffering from acute dementia. The first defendant, Ho Chu Lan, was the daughter of the plaintiff. Meanwhile, the second defendant, Lim Kyu Yao, was Ho Chu Lan's son and also the grandson of the plaintiff. So, initially, the court was told that the plaintiff Lim Kim Hwa lived with the first defendant of this case. Ho Chu Lan has taken care of the plaintiff and provided her with food and accommodation. The issue begins on the fact that the plaintiff owned a shop house at Kanowit in Sarawak and the first defendant was entrusted to manage the shop house. So, over the years, the plaintiff decided to make a will to devise and transmit the shop house. Hence, in 1983, the plaintiff successfully made a will which stated that half share of the shop house belonged to Lim Kyu Yao, the grandson, also the second defendant of this case. Another half of the share, on the other hand, will be divided among 3 grandchildren, which each will receive approximately 1/6 of the share. However, a year later in 1984, the plaintiff signed a memorandum of transfer, also known as MT1, giving the second defendant half ownership of the shop house. And in 1985, the plaintiff again signed another memorandum of transfer called MT2, passing the remaining half to the first defendant and another grandchild named Ho Chu Hyong. Afterwards, the plaintiff brought an action to the court for a declaration that the 2 memoranda of transfers, namely MT1 and MT2, were null and void on 2 grounds. Firstly, the plaintiff claimed that the transfer was raised through fraud and deception, which stipulates under Section 17 of the Contract Act 1950. Secondly, under undue influence, the plaintiff claimed that the first defendant induced her to part with the shop house. This is because the plaintiff believed that the real intention of daughter's providence was to prevent her from making a fair decision of the shop house. Hence, from these facts, 3 legal issues were established.
Hi and Assalamualaikum. My name is Manavati Nadira and I am here reporting from the High Court regarding the case of Lim Kim Hwa versus Ho Chu Lan. The plaintiff brought this case because she believed that the transfer of memoranda transferring her share of her shop house was null and void. She believed that the first defendant had obtained it by fraud. Apart from that, she also believed that there is an existence of element of undue influence. This is because the plaintiff was an illiterate old woman and the defendant had a special relationship with her, which is mother and daughter relationship. Therefore, there are 3 main issues needed to be highlighted from this case. Firstly, whether the execution of memoranda of transfer was null and void. Second, whether the first defendant had committed fraud. And lastly, whether the transferee is in a position to dominate the transferor's will. That is all for me. Thank you.
Plaintiff counsel may present your argument first.
Thank you, Yarif. So, first, I would like to direct your attention back to our legal issue. So our main legal issue here is to see whether the execution of the Memoranda of Transfers MP1 and MP2 are null and void. So in proving that the execution of the Memoranda of Transfers are null and void, we are relying on the ground fraud or dishonesty on the part of the first and second defendants, and undue influence on the part of the first defendant. So, first and second defendants have exercised active concealment that should be considered as fraud under Section 17, Section B of the Contracts Act, in the sense that the first defendant have the knowledge about the 1983 will, and he should be expected to disclose this information to the plaintiff, but somehow he did not. So this should be considered as fraud. And in the part of the first defendant, on the part of the first defendant, we should divide this into two parts: fraud relating to the beneficiaries and fraud relating to the plaintiff herself. So on the part of beneficiaries, the first defendant have the knowledge about the 1983 will, have the knowledge about the provision, but she did not disclose the fact about this 1983 will and the execution of the Memorandum of Transfer to the beneficiaries under 1983 will, mainly named Sun Chun-Ang, Teo Ho-Kyu, and Teo Sian Seong. So this should be considered as an active concealment. On the part of the plaintiff herself, the evidence, the most important evidence here is the fact that the plaintiff is forgetful and suffered from senility. So the plaintiff suggested that the first defendant should have the duty or the obligation to explain or remind to the plaintiff of all the related facts and information, so that the plaintiff could decide what to do with her property and depends within the limits of her mental capacity. So here, there should be a clear indication of active concealment to the plaintiff herself by the first defendant. And now moving on to our second element to answer this, our main legal issue here is undue influence on the part of first defendant. So we are referring to Section 16 of the Contracts Act 1950 to prove that under undue influence, execution of Memoranda of Transfer should be considered as null and void. Furthermore, we should refer to the case Tate against Williamson, in which Lord Chelmsford has stated that undue influence may arise from the special relationship between parties, and also the case Bainbridge against Brown, in which in establishing the relations between parent or person in loco parentis and child should be one to fall under the category of undue influence. So we can see here that the first defendant and the plaintiff has the relationship of mother and child. So it should be considered as there should be present the element of undue influence, and thus the Memorandum of Transfer should be considered as null and void. And the evidence that is important to prove that there is undue influence is the fact that the plaintiff is living and very much dependent on the first defendant, in the sense that the plaintiff is dependent on physically and even financially, because the plaintiff is, I must remind you, illiterate. So that's why she is very dependent to the first defendant, and thus the first defendant should have the effect to influence the transfer's will in executing the Memorandum of Transfer. That's all for my argument today.
Defense counsel, you may present your defense now.
Based on the accusation and evidences presented by the plaintiff's side, we can say that the second defendant, Lim Q Yao, was understood to have been using fraud to make the plaintiff execute the Memorandum of Transfer, MP1, or the Exhibit P4, regarding the transfer of half the share of her shop house to the second defendant, made on 3 May 1984. So, to prove Lim Q Yao innocent of fraud, let me present the following evidence. So, on the same date in 1984, which is on the 3rd of May, the plaintiff and the second defendant had went to the Kanawit District Office, where the Memorandum of Transfer was prepared by the defendant witness 4, Mr. Lim Ho Jin, who was the land agent in charge. the document was prepared upon the request by the plaintiff. So our defendant witness 4 had admitted to us that the purpose for the transfer as well as the contents of the document were read and explained to the plaintiff by himself. The plaintiff was confirmed to have understood the explanation before she proceeded to thumbprint the document. Also, the plaintiff's side did not indicate that the second defendant was even aware of the 1983 will's existence. The said will includes the intention of the plaintiff to transfer half the share of the shophouse to Lim Q Yao and 1/6 of the share for the other 3 grandchildren who were supposedly received a quarter of share each in the prior 1980 will before it was revoked. So according to the plaintiff's argument, they show no proof beyond reasonable doubt in showing how the second defendant is entitled to disclose anything regarding the 1983 will as he had no idea about the will. Okay, next, about this first defendant. She was accused for an active concealment of a known fact essential regarding the memorandum of transfer MT2 as what you have seen in Exhibit B1. She is also accused of undue influence during the execution of the same document. Alright, for the purpose of rebutting the plaintiff's accusations, I will stand for the first defendant's innocence by saying that the plaintiff was claimed to have been rushing the transfer of share of the shophouse, making the first defendant keep her silence on the 1983 will, which is under her custody. In addition, the contents of the memorandum of transfer MT2 was read and explained by the first defendant to the plaintiff as the duty of a daughter. That concludes the defendant's side of argument. Thank you.
Thank you, both plaintiff and defendant counsel. Right now, I'm going to give my judgment to this case. First of all, I think it's very crucial and important for me to highlight this, that in order for me to establish the elements of fraud in this case, a very high standard of proof is essential. So I am hereby will cite the case of Goh Hui Yin and Lim Tiong Gi. In this case, the learned judge in their finding has defining high standard of proof in order to establish fraud allegations. It stated that the purpose to cheat must have a significant impact on the decision in order for it to make a move. So in this case, in determining whether the second defendant has committed fraud as alleged by the plaintiff, I will refuse the allegation. This is on the ground that following there was an absence of evidence to indicate that the second defendant was aware of the presence of the original 1983 will at the time the first memorandum of transfer was signed. Hence, in my opinion, rules no question shall be arise concerning whether he was under any duty to report the said original 1983 will to the plaintiff and also to the land clerk when he and the plaintiff went to the district office to sign the first memorandum of transfer. However, I will allow the claim of undue influence made by the plaintiff to the first defendant, as in virtue of Section 16 of the Contract Act 1950, and also on the ground that the plaintiff and the first defendant have a special relationship, which is a parent and child. However, the court affirmed that not every fiduciary relationship has a potential to lift the suspicions of undue influence. So I am hereby cited the case of Benbridge and Browns, which in this case, it suggested that the relationship between mother and child could increase the possibility of undue influence. because in this case, we could see that the plaintiff and the first defendant share a residence. The first defendant has given the plaintiff food and lodging, so the plaintiff also entrusted the management of the shop house to the first defendant. So it actually clearly demonstrates that the plaintiff have depends on the first defendant. They are both physical and financial needs. So, and the plaintiff also was illiterate with a bad memory. Hence, I am in opinion that the first defendant actually holds a moral obligation to present the plaintiff with all facts and evidence, so the plaintiff could make decision on what to do with her property within her mental capacity. It could be assumed that the second memorandum of transfer involving the first defendant and plaintiff was null and void. Hence, in my finding, I also would like to lay down that the first defendant, being well conscious of the evidence, had purposely withheld crucial details from the plaintiff, information that she was obligated to reveal given their special relationship, which is a mother and child. So with the support of Section 20 of the Act, I ruled that the second memorandum was null and void. Last but not least, I determined that the plaintiff will be paid half of the action cost. So to summarize today's judgment, the judgment of the case today, the plaintiff claims against the first defendant was successful despite her failure to claims against the second defendant. I think that's all from me. Thank you.
So, what can be concluded from this case here is that the courts demand a high standard of proof for fraud under Section 17 of our Contracts Act 1950, and the learned justice also applied the same standard of proof for undue influence under Section 16 as well. As we go through this case, we can see that the relationship between the parent and the child or persons in loco parentis falls into the category of fiduciary relationship, which raises the presumption of undue influence. Alright, so before we end our news today, we would like to advise to those who enter into a contract or effecting a transfer based on bequeathed property to the beneficiaries under a will, make sure that every information is disclosed fully to the benefactor so as to eliminate the possibility that the contract will be declared null and void by the court. So that's wrap up our news today, and thank you for watching Dahlia Civilians, and until we meet again.